It is a really strange paradox. The people who fight the hardest to topple a dictator are um, often the most likely to unconsciously act exactly like one.
Yeah, which sounds completely illogical at first.
Right. It defies logic until you actually look closely at how the human brain functions under extreme chronic stress. So, welcome to today's deep dive.
We've got a really fascinating one today.
We really do. We are getting into the psychological machinery behind why societies in crisis crave authoritarian leaders and how we actively hallucinate a fake past to survive the present.
Plus how our digital architecture is, accelerating all of this collective anxiety.
Exactly. And the lens we are using today is a really interesting piece of source material. It's an audio transcript of an interview from Radio Irava.
Right, it's a sit-down between a journalist and a political psychologist named Mr. Iraj Abedini.
Yeah. And the focus of their conversation is this intricate, often completely invisible political psychology that governs a society right after it experiences a massive systemic shock.
Before we really dissect the mechanisms Abedini outlines, though, we do need to set a bit of a boundary for you listening.
Yeah, that is a great point. Just a quick heads up. This source material navigates some pretty heavily charged political territory.
Very charged. It uses the 1979 Iranian Revolution as a primary case study for societal trauma.
Right. And it also analyzes the behavior of monarchist groups, plus right-wing and left-wing factions in the West. So to be totally clear, our objective here is not to endorse any political platform.
Definitely not. We aren't validating any specific ideological faction or taking sides.
Exactly. We're strictly unpacking the behavioral patterns, the cognitive biases, and the psychological theories presented in the interview. We're looking at the architecture of the human mind here, not, the validity of a political ballot.
Well said. So the baseline for this entire analysis really starts with understanding the cognitive load of living in a traumatized society.
Okay, let's unpack this. What do we mean by cognitive load?
Well, the root cause of a population suddenly demanding a strong man like a magical savior is rarely born from a genuine ideological love for authoritarianism.
Right. It's not like people just wake up and think, hey, I really want a dictator.
Exactly. It is actually a symptom of profound psychological exhaustion. Abedini points to the aftermath of the 1979 revolution as this prime example. When a society undergoes a massive rupture like that, social trust just collapses entirely.
And then chronic insecurity sets in.
Yes, because the cognitive burden of a functioning democracy is incredibly high.
Oh, for sure. Navigating freedom requires a huge tolerance for ambiguity.
Right. It requires endless debate, compromise, and just, the sheer mental energy to coordinate with people you fundamentally disagree with.
I think a good way to look at this, if we think about it in terms of physical survival, is to imagine an exhausted swimmer in a stormy sea.
Ooh, yeah, I like that analogy.
Like you've been treading water for hours, right?
Yeah.
You're swallowing seawater, you are entirely disoriented.
You're completely drained.
Exactly. And swimming requires coordination. You have to chart a course, assess the currents, and that is the work of a functional democracy.
Which is exhausting when you're already drowning.
Right. But then if you see a massive rock jutting out of the water, you don't care if it's jagged. You don't care if clinging to it will slice your hands open.
Because that rock represents the strongman leader.
Yes. The appeal isn't the quality of the rock. The appeal is the immediate cessation of having to swim.
That's a perfect way to put it. The collective psyche simply cannot sustain the energy required for complex democratic negotiation when it's already overwhelmed by chronic anxiety.
Right. It's just too much.
So a paternalistic figure comes along offering simplified security. Someone who basically says, I will absorb all the complex decision-making and you will just follow.
And that becomes a defense mechanism. The mind just accepts subjugation as a trade-off for psychological relief.
Exactly. But what's fascinating here is that if the brain is willing to accept subjugation to stop the pain of the present, it also has to find a way to make the future seem less terrifying.
Oh, right. And the way it does that is by completely rewriting the past.
Yeah. In psychology, this is called the defensive reconstruction of the past.
Defensive reconstruction. Okay, so how is that different from just regular nostalgia, like missing the good old days?
Well, it operates way beyond standard nostalgia. When the current reality is unbearable and the future just looks dark and unpredictable, the collective mind aggressively edits historical memory.
Wow. Like hitting the delete key on reality.
Pretty much.
Oh.
It selectively curates a vision of the past that is completely sanitized. It portrays it as an era of absolute safety and stability.
And in doing so, it just actively deletes the historical realities of things like censorship, inequality, political imprisonment, or torture.
Exactly. And Abedini brings up a really specific media example to illustrate how this is weaponized.
Oh yeah, the network Noto TV.
Right. He points out how they heavily utilized selective archival footage to project an image of Iran's past that was purely aesthetic.
Like they would just broadcast the music, the fashion.
Right. Yes. The fashion, the mid-century modern architecture, this apparent societal stability.
So they essentially manufactured a synthetic golden age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Media platforms can provide the visual scaffolding for it, but the population accepts the illusion because the psychological demand for a comforting narrative is just so immense.
That makes total sense. A traumatized society will consume a beautifully curated lie about a stolen utopia because, well, confronting the grim, multifaceted reality of their history requires cognitive resources they just don't have anymore.
They're too exhausted to process the bad stuff.
Right. But if our brains are willing to hallucinate a flawless past just to cope with a chaotic present, that coping mechanism has to bleed into how a society attempts to build its future.
Oh, absolutely. And this brings us to the behavior of the opposition.
Yeah.
You know, the people actively trying to dismantle a dictatorship.
Which is so interesting because you would assume the groups fighting authoritarianism would naturally embody democratic principles, right? Like tolerance and freedom.
You'd think so. But Abedini argues the exact opposite often occurs. The culture of a dictatorship acts like a psychological contagion.
A contagion, like a virus.
Yeah, it seeps deeply into the collective psyche and infects the opposition itself. Individuals and groups fighting a regime frequently and entirely unconsciously reproduce the identical authoritarian behaviors they're trying to overthrow.
Wow. So this implies that the stated ideology of a movement is almost irrelevant.
Pretty much.
Like a group could have a progressive, supposedly democratic platform, but if the internal psychological structure of that movement treats disagreement as an existential threat.
Right, if they prioritize absolute fealty over objective truth.
Yeah, and label internal critics as mercenaries or traitors, then they are simply building a new authoritarian structure with different branding.
Exactly. And the mechanism driving this is what Abedini calls psychological identification with the leader.
Okay, let me ask a clarifying question for the listener here. How do we draw the line? I mean, if you simply have a favorite politician you passionately support, does that mean you're in a political cult?
That's a great question. So in a healthy political dynamic, a supporter views a leader as a fallible instrument of policy.
Okay, so if the leader fails to deliver or violates a core principle, the supporter withdraws their vote.
Right. The relationship is transactional and bounded by reality, but in a traumatized society, the boundary between the individual follower's ego and the leader's persona dissolves.
The leader gets elevated to this state of infallibility. They become sacred.
Exactly. And because that boundary has dissolved, political critique undergoes a really sinister translation in the brain.
So if I have psychologically identified with a leader and you criticize that leader's tax policy, my brain doesn't process that as an ideological disagreement.
Nope. Your amygdala fires as if I am launching a violent physical attack on your very existence.
Wow, that is terrifying.
It is. And to protect against that perceived existential threat, the group has to constantly manufacture enemies. Maintaining unquestioning internal cohesion requires an external target.
So anyone who refuses to offer total loyalty is immediately cast out as a traitor.
Exactly. And Abedini makes it a point to highlight that this architecture of sectarianism is completely ideology blind.
Right. He mentioned it takes root in left-wing collectives, right-wing populism, religious fundamentalist groups, and monarchist movements alike.
Whenever loyalty fully replaces critical thought, the cult of personality has defeated the institution.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because now we take that fragile threat-reactive psychology and plug it into a global communication system engineered to monetize those exact threat responses.
You're talking about social media.
Yep. Social media platforms do not operate as neutral town squares for debate. Abedini actually categorizes them as architectures of collective emotion.
That's such a perfect phrase.
Yeah.
Because the algorithms governing these platforms are optimized to reward polarization, outrage, and public humiliation.
Right. They extract the most vulnerable components of the political psychology we just outlined and amplify them.
The digital environment demands tribal warfare because, let's face it, nuanced, patient deliberation does not yield high engagement metrics.
It really doesn't. And Abedini ran a fascinating experiment to test the depth of this tribal reflex.
Oh, this part was wild.
Right. He authored a series of articles that were dense, critical takedowns of fascist mentalities. The text itself was an uncompromising critique of authoritarianism, but he attached an image of the Iranian lion and sun to these articles, which is a historical symbol that commands deep reverence among certain nationalist and monarchist factions.
And the response to the publication revealed the complete absence of independent critical thought.
Wait, they didn't even read the text?
Not at all. The articles accumulated massive engagement, likes, and shares, predominantly from the exact demographics the text was criticizing.
That is unbelievable. So they engaged with the content purely based on the visual trigger of the symbol.
Yes. They never processed the critical text attached to it. They weren't sharing an article. They were deploying a tribal banner.
So the algorithm conditioning has basically trained users that the visual symbol of their in-group is the only relevant data point.
It is a purely limbic response. It bypasses the prefrontal cortex entirely.
Wow. And this ties into what Abedini calls collective narcissism, right? He draws a sharp line between healthy civic pride and supremacist identity.
He does. And they are structurally very different.
Yeah, let's explain the difference using a neighborhood analogy. Because healthy nationalism is akin to a building with a deep, solid foundation.
Like loving your own family and taking care of your house.
Exactly. It has internal structural integrity, it can withstand high winds, it can endure criticism, and importantly, it doesn't require the demolition of the buildings around it to remain standing. You don't have to hate your neighbors to love your house.
Right. But collective narcissism, this supremacist political identity, is totally different. It's like a massive, ornate facade with absolutely zero foundation.
It's just deeply fragile.
So inherently fragile that the only way to keep the facade propped up is to constantly build scaffolding out of the destruction and humiliation of the other.
Right. And the source quotes a really specific mindset to illustrate this exclusivity, the belief that art is only with Iranians.
Yeah, that's a prime example. A supremacist identity requires the total erasure of anyone else's value to feel internally secure.
And the digital architecture of social media perfectly incentivizes this. It rewards the behavior of throwing rocks at the neighbors because humiliation drives algorithmic visibility.
So we have a human brain that defaults to seeking saviors to alleviate the exhaustion of trauma.
Right.
We have a coping mechanism that hallucinates a fake past.
Yep.
And we have a digital architecture that accelerates tribal rage while actively discouraging nuanced thought.
So what does this all mean? With all of these forces compounding, a society cannot simply vote its way out of this psychological trap.
No, it can't. Achieving true political maturity requires a fundamental psychological shift. We have to transition from hero worship to institution building.
Okay, let's dig into that.
Abedini emphasizes that democracy is not merely a ballot box. A ballot box is just an administrative tool. Democracy is the psychological capacity to tolerate profound differences. It's the ability to sit with ambiguity and accept the fundamental imperfection of all humans, particularly those in power.
It really requires abandoning the fantasy of the philosopher king. And the source uses the U.S. founding fathers as a really fascinating historical parallel here.
Yeah, James Madison specifically.
Right. Madison operated on the premise that if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. They did not design a system meant to identify and elevate a flawless, magical savior.
They knew better than that.
Exactly. They built a mechanical system of checks and balances specifically because they assumed leaders would be deeply flawed, selfish, and easily corrupted by power.
And Abedini also notes Thomas Jefferson's engagement with Xenophon's Cyropaedia.
Remind us what that is again.
It's an ancient text detailing the idealized, virtuous rule of Cyrus the Great. It is basically the ultimate blueprint for the wise king.
Oh, okay.
But the architects of modern democratic systems ultimately concluded that hoping for a wise king is a symptom of political immaturity.
Right, because a robust society does not require a good father. It requires accountable, resilient institutions.
Exactly. And the danger of failing to mature past the need for a savior is explored heavily by the historian Timothy Snyder in his book on tyranny, which Abedini cites in the interview.
Yes, Snyder introduces this concept of anticipatory obedience, which is just such a chilling phrase.
It's the darkest manifestation of a society giving up on institutions. Citizens, driven by a desperate need to belong to a powerful figure and to alleviate their own anxiety, will preemptively surrender their rights and align with an authoritarian before the authoritarian even demands it.
Right. So anticipatory obedience is a preemptive submission to basically relieve the cognitive dissonance of resistance.
People calculate that by submitting early, they secure a safe place in the new in-group.
Wow. And when that anticipatory obedience takes hold and trust in civic institutions evaporates, the society essentially loses its shared grip on reality.
Epistemic closure sets in. When the institutions fail, the collective brain demands a scapegoat to make sense of the enduring pain.
And real-world danger comes from that widespread misinformation. Abedini shares 2 examples of this paranoia, right?
Yeah, he witnessed a Canadian beggar who was absolutely convinced his poverty was the direct result of refugees secretly receiving all the government's funding.
Just completely detached from reality.
And he also notes a period in Sweden where sweeping, entirely false rumors stereotyped Iranian immigrants en masse as covert spies.
So when the system is broken, reality becomes entirely subjective and heavily weaponized.
This raises an important question, though. How do you fix it? The remedy to this systemic paranoia and the allure of the strongman requires something that traumatized societies are uniquely deprived of.
Which is what?
Immense enduring patience.
Man, patience is an agonizing demand to place on a society that feels like it is drowning.
It is the hardest ask imaginable.
Yeah.
Transitioning from a society that worships personalities to one that trusts institutions is incredibly slow, frustrating, and tedious work.
Because it means giving up that dopamine hit.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
It requires citizens to relinquish the immediate, intoxicating dopamine hit of righteous anger and algorithmic outrage.
And it demands letting go of the comforting illusion that a strong man can instantly impose order.
The work of building civic institutions requires embracing the unglamorous reality of negotiating with factions you despise just to maintain the structural integrity of the state.
Yeah. It's the painful transition from asking who will save us to asking how do we build a system where we don't need saving? From seeking a parental savior to accepting the heavy responsibilities of civic adulthood.
Well said. And until that psychological shift occurs, a society will remain locked in a cycle of replacing one tyrant with another, continually mistaking a change in branding for a change in governance.
We have covered immense psychological ground today.
We really have.
For you listening, we've basically traced how the exhaustion of collective trauma bypasses our critical faculties, creating a desperate demand for an authoritarian rock to cling to.
We've seen the mind's capacity to aggressively hallucinate a fake golden age, to hide from the terrifying ambiguity of the future.
Yep. And we've looked at how algorithmic architecture feeds on this anxiety, transforming the search for safety into aggressive, fragile, tribal warfare.
The ultimate takeaway from Abedini's analysis is that true political maturity requires a massive leap of faith.
Right. The courage to abandon the mythology of the perfect savior and embrace the messy reality of institutions. But to bring this entirely back to you listening, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If the human mind naturally edits the past to suit our present anxieties, what elements of your own personal history might you be selectively remembering to justify your current political or social beliefs?
That's an unsettling but very necessary question to explore.
How much of your own core identity today is anchored to a personal golden age that, upon closer inspection, might never have actually existed? Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll catch you on the next one.